how meticulous he is in getting things right, finding out the eyewitnesses, making sure that everything is just as it should be. So that's just a little bit of an introduction into our reading, and so we turn to Luke chapter 1, and it starts off like this. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. That's the introduction. And then he starts. In the time of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zachariah, who belonged to the priestly division of Abijah. His wife Elizabeth was also a descendant of Aaron. Both of them were upright in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commandments and regulations blamelessly. But they had no children, because Elizabeth was barren, and they were both well along in years. Once, when Zachariah's division was on duty and he was serving as priest before God, he was chosen by Lot, according to the custom of the priesthood, to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. And when the time for the burning of the incense came, all the assembled worshippers were praying outside. Then an angel of the Lord appeared to him, standing at the right side of the altar of incense. When Zachariah saw him, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zachariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to give him the name John. He will be a joy and delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. He is never to take wine or other fermented drink, and he will be filled with the Holy Spirit, even from birth. Many of the people of Israel will he bring back to the Lord their God, and he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord." Are you ready for the Lord? Because he will come back again, you know. And so John was there to make the people ready for the first coming of Jesus. Zechariah asked the angel, "How can I be sure of this? I am old, and my wife is well along in years." The angel answered, "I am Gabriel. I stand in the presence of God, and I have been sent to speak to you and to tell you this good news. And now you will be silent and not able to speak until the day this happens, because you did not believe my words, which will come true at their proper time." Meanwhile, the people were waiting for Zechariah and wondering why he stayed so long in the temple. When he came out, he could not speak to them. They realized he had seen a vision in the temple, for he kept making signs to them, but remained unable to speak. When his time in service was completed, he returned home. After this, his wife Elizabeth became pregnant, and for 5 months remained in seclusion. That's where we're going to end at verse 24. You can read the rest of the chapter. It's a fantastic story. Luke is such a good story writer. And in some ways, you could just read the story. I don't really need to say anything. But I'm sorry, you're going to get something of what I think the Lord has given to me for you this morning. So I'm going to start off with, does anyone here, are you brave enough to put your hands up? Have you been on jury service? Anyone here? 1, 2, 3. Nobody else? Anyone been twice? Twice. twice? 3 times? No. Oh, I've never been called. So that goes along with some of you. Well, it's quite interesting. In Zechariah's time, you see, this was once in a lifetime opportunity for Zechariah. This was an incredible privilege to burn incense before God. There were 24 divisions, and he belonged to one division of the priests, Abijah. And so they were chosen, so that's what? I think it's twice, did you say twice a year, something like that they get called up and they're on duty. But there's loads of them. And so it's by lot that they're chosen who will burn incense. And it only happens once, so it's only those who have not burned incense before that are chosen. And so there's Zechariah. He is chosen. Now, I don't know whether you know much about Zechariah, but he was a bit of a hillbilly. Excuse the phrase, it's probably a bit American really, but he lived in the hill country. He was not one of the big priests or the posh priests or those that lived in the city or were grand. No, he was somebody out in the sticks, unknown. And Zechariah and Elizabeth didn't have a child, so they were probably considered something wrong with them. We don't know what the sin is, but surely God is not blessing them. And so they must have done something wrong to make God angry, so that they don't have a child. But God makes very clear through Luke that actually they were blameless before God, Zechariah and Elizabeth. And so this is very special, and they are chosen in a very special way by God. It's so wonderful that this man who had been waiting, his wife had been waiting, they'd been praying for a child. Of course, they were also part of praying for the coming of the Messiah, which is what all of the Israelites did. And because they are righteous before God, then that's what they would have been doing, praying and seeking for the Messiah to come. And so they are old. We don't know how old, maybe in the late 50s, early 60s, something like that. And so Zechariah travels up to Jerusalem, having been chosen, and there he is. Now, I don't know whether you know anything about the temple. You might have seen pictures of the temple. So you've got the outer courts, courts of the Gentiles, and then you go into the main building. And there is the holy place, and that's where the incense would be offered. And then there's a big curtain, which was torn in two when Jesus was crucified. And behind that curtain was the Holy of Holies. That was where God presenced himself. Okay? That's where the Ark of the Covenant was. And it was only once a year that the high priest could go in, and boy, would he get out quick. Because anything that was wrong, if he had not gone through the right ceremonies and done the right things, he was in danger of being struck down dead. That's how serious it was. And even for Zechariah going in, there were those way back who had burned incense, which was unauthorized incense, and been struck down by God. You can read that in Exodus about that. But here you have Zechariah going in, already a little bit scared, going in to this semi-darkness. You've got nice windows here. They didn't have many windows certainly in there. It was a closed room. And there was, I don't know whether you know what a menorah is. It was the big lampstand. So that was on the right-hand side as you went towards the big curtain. Just in front of the curtain in the middle was the altar of incense, and that's where the incense would be burned. So there's Zechariah. He's standing there in front of the altar in this semi-darkness. There's the lampstand just to give him sunlight. And that's where he is. And he is burning the incense as required. Hands shaking, probably tummy wobbling. He was probably wanting to do this as best as he could and get out again. It was all about the speed of doing something for the Lord and then getting out. Phew, safe. But he notices on his right-hand side, so this is where the lamp is on that side, the altar in front of him. Out of the corner of his eye, he sees this angel. Now, anyone seen an angel? I think there might be fewer of you than have done jury service actually seeing an angel. The Bible tells us actually that we might have seen an angel without knowing it. So you never know. You might have seen an angel, you just don't know that you've seen one. But this is Gabriel. This is one of the archangels, one of the mighty warriors of God. And he stands there. Well, if Zechariah wasn't frightened beforehand, he certainly is. And if you read, typically the greeting of an angel is, "Do not be afraid." Why? Because everyone is terrified. If an angel walked in here, I don't know what we would do. I don't know what I would do. Because we don't bow down and worship an angel, we worship God. But we would be terrified, I'm sure. So there's this angel. And starts to speak to Zechariah. There he is. This is what the angel says. We go back to that reading. Do not be afraid, Zechariah, your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to give him the name John. He will be a joy and a delight to you, and many will rejoice because of his birth. For he will be great in the sight of the Lord. And then he gives him instructions never to take wine or other fermented drink. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even from birth. Many of the people of Israel will he bring back to the Lord their God. And he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Wow! Do you realise all of that fear? When the angel speaks some wonderful words of promise and goodness and help. That should have calmed Zechariah's fear. And within that, and within Zechariah's response, I just want to mention this. Because when I was a child, my parents moved house. Some of you have probably moved house. And where we moved to, opposite that house, was a lady missionary. Well, she had been on the mission field in Africa, and she was home. And that's where she was living. And she was praying. She prayed earnestly before the Lord. And she was praying for two things. She was praying for the house opposite, because she knew it was for sale, that Christians would move in. Okay? Simple. That was her prayer. The other prayer was the Baptist church she went to in the next village. she was praying for youth leaders in that church, that there might be youth leaders, because there were quite a lot of young people at that time, but there was nobody really who they could relate to. And so that's what she was praying earnestly. And what's amazing is God answered the prayer in one. 2 prayers, almost separate probably in her mind, but God answered them. Family, which was my family, Christians, moved in. I became a Christian a little bit later, so I wasn't a Christian at that point. But in the Baptist church, my sisters, my older sisters, they helped with the young people. So again, God answers our prayers. Now Zechariah was probably praying for 2 things. He'd probably given up, actually, praying for a child, because there's no chance. And so he'd probably given up praying. That doesn't mean to say God hadn't heard. But he was also would have been praying for the coming of the Messiah. Now, he didn't know that actually God was bringing those 2 things together in him. And so Zechariah's in a right mess. And he's in this position and he says, yeah, but how do I know this is going to be true? Well, the angel has a wonderful answer. There might have been a sternness because Zechariah doesn't believe and doesn't trust God. And so what happens is this angel silences Zechariah. Do you realise God can do such things? He's the one that gives us speech, and he is the one that can silence. It's amazing because he is a God of speech. But there is a reason for the silence. The Old Testament, all through the prophets, God had been speaking to his people, all through that time, all through the years, whether the people had listened. They rejected the prophets very often. Jeremiah, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and it goes on. And then the last one in the Bible, Malachi, writes this. The last 2 verses in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. Now that's remarkably like the verses actually I've read for you. You might not remember them. But these are the verses I read to you that Luke wrote that the angel spoke. And he will go before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of their fathers to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous. And he had to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. Amazing words, incredible words, that God should speak so directly to Zechariah. But Zechariah fails to speak, and he's silenced. And it's almost as if the 400 years, or that time of silence where the prophets had not been speaking in Israel, is replicated by Zechariah's own silence. But that doesn't mean to say God is not speaking. And actually, it's through the silence that God speaks. It's through Zechariah's silence that God is speaking. I find it quite amazing that God is able, even in someone's unbelief, to use them and to bring good out of that, and ultimately bring them to that point of belief. And we'll see that in a moment. But you've got Zechariah there, silenced. And the people that he comes out to, there they are, they've been waiting there, waiting and waiting. They knew how important it was for someone to go in, burn the incense, and get out. And so the fact that Zechariah got stuck in the temple was really unusual, and they're getting very worried about it. And he comes out, and they're even more worried because he can't speak, he can't tell them why. We don't know whether he was both deaf and dumb, or how he was trying to communicate. But it must have been very, very difficult for him. Very difficult indeed for him to communicate. And so he goes home. That's it, job done. That once-in-a-lifetime experience has been one once-in-a-lifetime experience. Quite amazing for him. And so he goes home. And Elizabeth, and the name John means God is gracious. God is gracious. Not Zechariah, he's not going to be called Zechariah after his father, but John. Because he's going to be different and prepare the way for the Lord. But when he comes home, there's Elizabeth. And you can imagine what was going on there. She would be very confused about what had gone on. But what's amazing is she accepts, well, that's certainly the way that the text that follows from our reading gives us the indication. She accepts what God is doing. And she confines herself during her pregnancy. And then Mary is visited. By Gabriel again. So Gabriel's got quite a lot of work to do. So he visits and goes into Galilee and visits Mary and tells her that her relative Elizabeth is going to have a son. And so she runs off to find Elizabeth. She has somebody who understands what has happened in her own life. She has got someone in Elizabeth, not only who is a relative, but who is like-minded about what God is doing. And so you can imagine how great and wonderful. She couldn't really tell anybody else what the angel had said at that time. It was so difficult. Yet she could go to Elizabeth and tell her. And Mary greets Elizabeth. That's all you get is she's probably just saying, Shalom, Elizabeth, it's Mary, or whatever she would say. And at that time, the baby that's in Elizabeth's womb leaps for joy. And Elizabeth herself, she speaks out in praise by the Holy Spirit. Such an incredible story, such a wonderful story. And so time goes by, the baby is born, and there's a little bit of a battle that goes on. This battle, because you've got the men of the family. The men of the family very often are troublemakers. I don't know whether you have that in your family, and brothers, so on and so forth, uncles, nephews, the boys, grandchildren, can be a real pain. And that's the case here. They want the baby that's just been born to be called Zechariah after the father. Zechariah can't speak. And he's probably intimidated by it all as well. So there you've got this situation where there's this battle going on. And in some ways it's not really Elizabeth's place to step up and say, but she does. She speaks out. It's all about silence and it's all about speaking. And she speaks out. His name should be called John. Now, all those people of the family, no, we don't believe you. We want to hear it from Zechariah, but he couldn't speak. So he writes, his name is John. Just for your information, the tablet that he writes on, this gives us an indication of who Luke is. Because the tablet is something that a doctor would have used in writing things down. So you get an instance and a link between Luke the doctor, but also Luke the writer. And so there he is. His name is John. Once written, the silence is broken, as the angel had promised. And Zechariah speaks out in praise, and that's what we had at the beginning of our service. He speaks about John, and he speaks about Jesus and what God is doing. You see, in a dark world, God is at work. It was a dark world then. The first thing that Luke tells us is that Herod was on the throne. Now, if anything would send shivers through you, it would be the fact that Herod would be on the throne. He was a murderer. He murdered his own wife. He murdered two brothers-in-law. He even gathered, when he was about to die, he even gathered all of the elders of the people into an area. And so when he died, they were to be murdered as well, because then people would mourn. This man was really, really sick. And we know about the children that were murdered in Bethlehem. He was so bad that that doesn't even make the history books. That's how evil this man was. And so you've got that, as well as the Romans being present. But God is at work, you see. The darkness is there, but the light is greater. The light pushes back the darkness. This is what's so wonderful. So that's the story. But what can we learn? What can we take away from this incredible story? How does that help us to live? Zechariah, with such a miraculous appearance of an angel, did not trust God. My favourite, I must admit, right from, I can't remember when, my verse that I always go to is, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Don't lean on your own understanding. Zechariah leant on his own understanding, and he was afraid and terrified, and as a consequence, he was silenced only for 9 months.